When I worked as a therapist, one of the first things I always asked new clients was, have you ever been in therapy? And if so, how was it? And most of them who had been in therapy before tended to describe it like this. I guess it was nice to have someone to talk to, but we didn't really get much done. While incredibly well-intentioned, many therapists are not actually very effective because they don't understand what really causes most emotional struggles and how to work through them well. Hi, my name's Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind, a free weekly newsletter where I show practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and well-being. In the rest of this video, I'm going to share 3 things most therapists believe that are not only wrong, but actually get in the way of their clients making true progress in therapy. My hope is that this helps people make more informed decisions about their emotional health, especially if they choose to pursue therapy. Number 1, you need to explore the pains of your past to free yourself from the problems of your present. For over a century, psychology has been obsessed with the old Freudian idea that emotional struggles are universally caused by traumas from your past, and that to free yourself from this struggle in your present, you need to spend an ungodly amount of time and energy and money, frankly, exploring and questioning and processing every bad thing that happened to you in your past life. Thankfully, research and clinical experience suggesting that this is actually not true. Now, I'm not going to burden you with a long scientific literature review, but let me just make a few observations that hopefully reinforce this point. First, just because exploring your past sometimes is helpful doesn't mean it's always helpful or that it's a requirement. There's obviously a time and place for reflecting on your past. And when done thoughtfully and intentionally and in the service of your goals and aspirations for the future, this can be quite helpful. But if you find that you're spending most of your time and energy sort of wallowing in the past with not very much to show for it in terms of how you're doing in the present and the degree to which you're actually moving towards your goals and aspirations in the future, that might be an indicator that you need to rethink your approach to emotional health, including finding a therapist who's willing to work with present you to actually do things differently now, in the here and now, instead of kind of staying stuck co-ruminating with past you about everything that happened earlier in your life. One way to think about it is, the past matters, but what you do in the present matters much more for your emotional health and well-being. Now, the next point I want to make about this is that intensive revisiting of the past actually has risks, even if you think there are some benefits. And in my experience, there are 2 kind of main risks that most therapists or clients don't even consider or don't consider nearly enough. The first one is rumination and overthinking. When you spend an hour every single week in therapy with your therapist, and most of that hour is spent thinking about and processing and basically living in the past, that establishes a pattern which makes it much easier to fall into unhelpful thought patterns like rumination during the rest of your days and hours and throughout the week. Okay, so this ruminating in therapy under the guise of exploring your past often just makes people a lot more vulnerable to rumination when you're outside of therapy. And of course, rumination makes nearly every emotional health struggle a lot worse, whether it's anxiety or depression or insomnia or procrastination or whatever it is. The next one is dependency and loss of agency. See, when therapy is exclusively framed in terms of your present struggles being the result of or caused by your past events in your life, and that the only way to free yourself from those is to spend a ton of time under the guidance of a professional working through all those things in the past, well, a consequence of that is, understandably, people tend to lose a lot of agency and become kind of helpless almost. So it's important to keep in mind that a good therapist, their primary job is for you not to need them anymore, ideally as quickly as possible. Now, when I was a therapist, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my own personal experience as a therapist, because I think it helps reinforce this bigger point about people getting too obsessed with the past and as a result, not focusing enough on the present. But anyway, I was a therapist, I'm a psychologist, and I practiced as a therapist for a long time, and I specialized in helping people with anxiety issues. So things like panic or OCD, phobias, social anxiety, health anxiety, stuff like that. Performance anxiety was another one. And frankly, I had a lot of success with my clients. My clients saw a lot of pretty dramatic improvements pretty quickly. Not everybody, but definitely a lot of people. One was a businesswoman who was in her 50s, but struggled with panic attacks, a lot of panic attacks, like at least one or two a week. And she had been for decades. Can you imagine decades of weekly panic attacks? It was awful, awful. But she was virtually panic free after a month, 1 month. Another one I remember is a kind of a youngish father who had chronic insomnia. It had been going on for years, I think 4 or 5 years, basically since the birth of his first child. He had a couple more kids since then, but he had just been struggling with really bad insomnia ever since then. And within 3 weeks, he did not meet criteria for insomnia. One more I'll share with you. There was this elderly woman I worked with really persistent generalized anxiety. She'd had it for decades and decades. And I remember her saying after just 5 or 6 weeks, what she told me was, I'm calmer and less worried than I can ever remember feeling. Now, I'm not sharing these with you to brag about my talents as a therapist, because actually, I don't think I was especially talented as a therapist. If you talk to my supervisors or mentors in grad school or even some of my colleagues when I was working, they tell you that I was a pretty averagely talented therapist. Like, I was decent, but I was not spectacular by any means. Instead, I think the reason so many of my clients were able to have success, it had less to do with my skills and talents and more with the way I thought about and approached therapy. And a big part of that was I was willing to stay focused on using what we know from research is really, really effective. And pertinent to our bigger point here, I was really focused on the present, specifically what people were doing in the present. So for my woman with panic, I spent a little bit of time kind of taking a history and trying to understand, when the panic attack started and what might have been the initial triggers for those. But the vast majority of our time together, we did what's called interoceptive exposure therapy, which is a very technical, fancy sounding term for a pretty straightforward idea, which means helping people build the confidence to feel anxiety without trying to get rid of it. That's all it is. And there's a variety of ways to do that, but that's basically all we did in therapy. We did not spend basically any time outside of the first session talking about her parents or her childhood or how stressful her early parts of her career were or any of that kind of stuff. Because I knew through both the scientific literature and my own experience, just doing a lot of interoceptive exposure therapy was wildly successful for panic. And it turns out that was true for her. Within weeks, she was panic-free. And as far as I know, and I stayed in touch with her for, I think at least a year, maybe a little bit more. She used to text me sometimes in situations that used to trigger panic for her. And she'd tell me, I'm on a flight and I didn't have a panic attack, or, I'm driving on the freeway and no panic. So I kept in touch with her, and she, as far as I know, never had another panic attack. Pretty remarkable when you think about it. Or if you think about my guy with sleep anxiety and insomnia, I spent a little bit of time asking about when did the insomnia start and what do you think the trigger was? And shockingly to no one, he started having trouble sleeping and developed insomnia when he had his first kid. Because as anyone who has ever had an infant knows before, you don't sleep a whole lot. So not surprising. But anyway, his insomnia persisted, which it doesn't for most people. Most people kind of go back to sleeping well once they're kind of through the weeds on a tough situation like that. But we essentially just implemented a few core practices from what's called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is this incredibly effective framework and program for helping people work through insomnia that for some crazy reason, almost nobody knows about. Clients, therapists, psychiatrists, doctors, I don't know why. It's the gold standard. It's by far the most effective way to treat sleep issues and insomnia, and no one talks about it. It beats me why this is the case. But as with most of my clients with insomnia, this gentleman made significant progress just within a few weeks. It wasn't necessarily easy what we did, the techniques we implemented. They were hard and challenging, but his growth was tremendous and very, very fast because, again, we were focused on doing things differently in the present, not endlessly rehashing stuff that had happened in the past. And then lastly, my elderly woman with generalized anxiety, I spent a lot of time gently redirecting her away from her instinct to rehash all of her admittedly significant childhood issues and really negative, awful things that had happened to her, that in her mind were what were causing her anxiety in the present. And instead, we focused on changing her relationship to anxiety now, what she does and how she thinks about anxiety in the present. And primarily, almost all of it was just we implemented this really consistent scheduled worry routine. And scheduled worry is it's another one of my favorite kind of exercises in all of emotional health, but it's especially helpful with chronic worry and chronic anxiety. It basically just means making time to worry on purpose every day. Sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually phenomenally effective. If you're interested in that, by the way, you can go to, I maintain a little mini website called scheduledworry.com that sort of explains what it is and how to do it. And there's a little guide you can download. So you can check that out. I'll put a link in the description below as well. So anyway, those are just some examples of how, as a therapist, I had a lot of success focusing really rigorously on the present rather than the past when I was helping my clients work through their emotional struggles. Now, of course, I'm not saying the past doesn't matter at all. There are definitely cases and situations and people where a more in-depth exploration of the past is really helpful and is required. And to be honest, there aren't wildly effective techniques like the ones I've talked about for every issue under the sun. There are some forms of depression, for instance, and things like eating disorders, which to the best of my knowledge, we just really struggle as a field to help people work through. They're just really tough. We haven't kind of cracked the nut on them, so to speak. But there are plenty of things, almost anything in anxiety, again, sleep, insomnia, a lot of more mild to moderate forms of depression. We are wickedly good at helping people work through these things if you know what you're doing and if you stay focused on the present. So just to recap, the bigger point here that I'm trying to get across is I believe good therapy should be squarely focused on the present, what you are doing or not doing in the here and now, and not what happened to you in the past. If you want to learn more about therapy and finding a therapist who can help you work through emotional struggles in this way that I'm describing, which again, for most people, I think is the most effective. I'm sure there are exceptions to that, and that's fine. But if you like this approach and you resonate with it, I wrote an article called How to Find a Great Therapist, which is a short, easy to read article about my, I don't know, there's like 7 or 8 kind of key ideas that I think people should keep in mind as they're searching for and trying out therapists. So if you want to do therapy, but you want to be smart and thoughtful about selecting a therapist, check that article out. I will put a link to it in the description below this video. Okay, so that sort of sums up this first point about people getting sort of overly obsessed with the past and not focusing on what's actually happening in the present. So that's number one, the biggest mistake I think most therapists make with their clients. The next one we're going to talk about is all about relationships and communication. Number 2, relationship problems are communication problems. You hear this everywhere, all the time. It's a cliche, even among mental health professionals who should know better, including like couples counselors, people who specialize in working with partners in a serious romantic relationship. But you just, again, you hear this cliche all the time that the reason people are struggling with their relationship is that they can't communicate well. And so they spend most of their time and energy in couples counseling trying to work on communicating better with each other. Now, the funny thing about this, if you stop and think about it, most people, even with really serious relationship problems, they aren't generally bad communicators. Like if you talk to anyone else in their life, extended family members, coworkers, friends, whatever, anyone who knows these people, what they will probably tell you is like, yeah, they're at least kind of average communicators. They're not desperately poor communicators who need, to totally retool their communication skill set. No, in every other area of life, they can communicate perfectly adequately, oftentimes exceptionally. So the problem here, it's not a deficit of communication skill or ability. That is not the core problem. Poor communication in a relationship is a symptom, not the underlying cause. Well, if that's the case, what is the underlying or root cause of most people's relationship problems? In my experience, there are 2 really big, really common root causes of relationship conflict. And those are values misalignment and poor emotion management. First, values misalignment. Now, values misalignment means that 2 people are in a relationship and they have significant disagreements about what is right and wrong in an important area of life. And often they have significant disagreements about this in multiple areas of life. So, for example, on the topic of money, let's say, one partner thinks it is never okay to be in debt and you should avoid debt at any cost, no matter what the situation, while the other partner in the relationship thinks like, debt's a little bit of debt's fine as long as it's not crazy. Why are you so worked up about it? It's not a big deal. On the topic of sex, maybe you have one partner who thinks frequent sex is a really important part of intimacy and maintaining a healthy relationship, and so we should be having sex really regularly. And the other partner thinks it's not that important, and like, I'm fine if it just happens every once in a while. Or on the topic of politics or social issues, maybe one partner is strongly pro-choice and the other partner is strongly anti-abortion. Now you can think there's hundreds, thousands of potential issues like this. These are just some of the most common ones that I would hear frequently. But the point here is that when two people fundamentally disagree about what is right or wrong in matters of high significance, that's key, high significance, there's just going to be a lot of conflict and tension and stress in that relationship. Can you think of the occasional counterexample? Sure. But for most people, most of the time, it's very, very hard to have a healthy, satisfying, effective relationship if you fundamentally disagree on what's right or wrong in key areas of life. Of course, many couples, quote unquote, find themselves in this situation after years of being in a relationship because, understandably, either one or both of them were not especially honest or candid about how they really felt on some of these core issues. Because as I think all of us can relate to, in the early days of a romantic relationship, it's very natural to sort of emphasize and keep focus on our points of commonalities and sort of what we share. And we tend to avoid things where we know, or at least intuit, there are going to be pretty significant differences. And if you think about it, just like couples want to avoid those major disagreements or points of misalignment in the early days of a relationship because everything feels so good and like, why do you want to bring up tough stuff, right? They also tend to want to avoid acknowledging that possibility in later stages of the relationship because either A, it would mean their relationship is not really what they thought or hoped it was, or B, it means there's a strong possibility that the relationship will never be that, will never fit that vision of what they so desperately want it to be. Now, as you can probably imagine listening to this is a pretty serious problem. And it's a really uncomfortable problem to admit to or face up to or even acknowledge. So as a result, I think a lot of people and their therapists end up scapegoating communication as the core problem in a relationship because they don't want to admit or face up to the fact that a more serious, significant problem is at play, and that is values misalignment. Okay, the second one is poor emotion management. The ability to manage your emotions well, skillfully, confidently, fluidly, that's at the heart of almost every form of emotional health and resilience. You just have to be able to deal with difficult emotions well, maturely, skillfully. But it's also really essential for just about any kind of healthy relationship, including primary romantic relationships. So think about it. How happy and healthy is your relationship going to be if you get defensive and hypercritical anytime your partner tries to give you feedback or good faith criticism? Because you just frankly can't tolerate or deal well with anxiety and your insecurities. Or maybe you or your partner avoids talking about anything that makes you feel sad or disappointed because basically you're afraid to be vulnerable. Or maybe you use alcohol or overeating as a way to cope with your stress, but you aren't willing to admit this to your spouse or even to yourself maybe. Of course, I could go on with instances of poor emotion management skills, but the gist of it is pretty straightforward. It's hard to have a healthy relationship when both parties aren't willing or able to manage difficult emotions well. In fact, I would go so far as to say that in every instance of poor communication in a relationship, the reason is they're upset and struggling with difficult emotions in the context of their relationship, and they are either unable or unwilling to deal with those emotions in a mature, healthy way. And the result of that is that they don't communicate particularly well. Now, to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying that poor communication is not a problem for couples who are struggling in their relationship. What I'm saying is it's not the core problem. And almost always, it's a function of two much more fundamental issues: values misalignment and poor emotion management skills. So, speaking of emotion management skills, if that is a topic that you are interested and want to learn a lot more about, I teach a course a couple times a year that's called Mood Mastery, and it's a live masterclass where I go through my kind of program for building emotional strength and resilience. It's essentially learning how to become much more skillful and confident managing any difficult emotion, from anxiety and anger to sadness and guilt and grief. If you're interested in that, again, I will put a link to it in the description of this video. Okay, so let's move on to our third and final mistake or misconception that most therapists have. Number 3, if you're anxious, you need more coping skills. Oh man, I don't even know where to start with this one. It seems like everybody, from therapists and teachers to parents and HR professionals, just everybody in society these days, just cannot get enough of this idea of coping skills. It's everywhere. So basically, the way people think about emotional health is this. I feel bad, so I need to open up my toolbox of mental health coping skills and apply one of them and then feel better. That's the idea. That's the whole idea. Unfortunately, that is not how the human mind works. And in fact, this whole approach, what I call the coping mindset, it actually makes you more emotionally fragile, not strong and resilient in the long run. So here's what actually happens when you use coping skills to manage your anxiety, or really any difficult emotion. You feel anxious, let's say. So you immediately try to lessen or get rid of that anxiety by whipping out one of your favorite coping skills. Maybe it's deep breathing, maybe it's, repeating positive mantras, maybe it's prayer, maybe it's mindfulness. I don't know, it could be almost anything can be used as a coping mechanism or coping skill, by the way. Now, here's the thing. When you do that, you will probably feel a little bit of temporary relief. You will feel a little bit less anxious. The problem is, even though it feels like it quote unquote worked, you have to think about what is your brain learning when you do this. And when your brain sees you either running away from or trying to get rid of something, including your own anxiety, it learns that it's a threat and bad and dangerous, which means the next time you start to feel anxious, you're going to get anxious about being anxious, which is going to make your anxiety way, way worse. This is why people are constantly collecting and implementing coping skills, and while they feel a little bit better in the short term, they never actually get any better. Their anxiety never really goes away. They don't ever really start to feel more confident because you're engaging in this process, which technically is called emotional fear learning. By running away from or trying to get rid of something, in this case, your own anxiety, you're teaching your brain that it's dangerous. And when your brain thinks that its own emotions are dangerous, that is a setup for chronic long-term anxiety. And this is why coping skills never really work long-term to address anxiety, because you're trading short-term relief for long-term intensification. Now, the alternative is what I call the confidence mindset. The confidence mindset means cultivating the belief that while uncomfortable, anxiety is not bad and that you don't have to do anything about it when you feel it. And actually, this is the basis for every single effective approach to anxiety out there. Stop trying to get rid of your anxiety and learn to accept it instead. Unfortunately, learning to genuinely accept and tolerate your anxiety instead of coping with it and temporarily making yourself feel a little bit better, that's really difficult and uncomfortable. And this is why I think most therapists aren't willing to use this approach, because it means them having to tolerate their clients being really anxious and uncomfortable, often more so than they were when they walked in the door. In other words, they're basically afraid of their clients feeling bad. And sadly, this only exacerbates people's anxiety issues in the long run. On the other hand, a good therapist will help you to confront and tolerate that anxiety rather than colluding with your natural instinct to avoid it or eliminate it with coping skills. So if you couldn't tell already, I'm really passionate about anxiety. It's like my favorite topic. I love helping people work through anxiety. It's just the best because you can absolutely do it. And it's your life is so much more awesome on the other side of chronic worry and anxiety. So anyway, I have a few resources on anxiety specifically that I would recommend if you want to start working on that. The first, I mentioned it earlier, but this idea of scheduled worry, it's a really simple, straightforward practice, and it is so helpful, especially if your anxiety involves kind of chronic anxiety and just a lot of generalized worry about all sorts of things. So I'd really recommend you check that out. Again, I have a little website called scheduledworry.com. I'll put a link to it. You can check that out. And then the other one, if you want sort of more structure and guidance, I teach a whole course called Creating Calm. And it's essentially me walking through my system that I've developed over the years for fundamentally rechange their relationship with anxiety. Not get rid of it, right? But to change their relationship with it and build confidence. And then again, that's called Creating Calm, and you can check that out. I'll put another link in the description below. All you need to know. Most therapists are incredibly kind, incredibly supportive, and very well-intentioned people. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean they're all that effective. If you choose to work on your emotional health in the context of therapy, it is your responsibility to find a therapist who is both able and willing to do the frequently uncomfortable work of helping you actually address your issues productively. And to help you do that well, here are 3 red flags that I commonly see in therapists. Getting stuck in the past, mistaking poor communications for a cause rather than a symptom of relationship problems. And lastly, using coping skills as a way to address anxiety. All right, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more from me about my own approach to emotional health and resilience, again, I write a free weekly newsletter. It goes out every Monday morning, and it's full of, I answer reader questions, I write essays and guides, I do videos like this, all aimed at trying to help people in very simple, practical ways build more emotional health and resilience in their life. So if you're interested in checking that out, I really recommend it. There's a link to it in the description below. And once again, thank you so much for watching the video.